What is up, folks? My name is Dan, this is Untitled Tavern, you are most certainly welcome, and this is going to be a list on vampires. Now, the reason we are sitting on a sofa right now, we're not stood up in front of a green screen or anything like that, is because, I mean, the green screen is literally right here in front of me. It's not on the walls. Me and Lindsay just moved house, so we've been packing for the last few weeks. We've been cleaning up the old place, trying to unbox everything in here. So it's been a really hectic last couple of weeks, which is why I've not really been loading much to YouTube. Anyway, whereas Donald Trump tried to make America great again, I am going to try and make vampires great again in this here Rakdos Vampire Aggro deck. Now, Modern Horizons has been and gone. We've seen Hogaak decks, we've seen Season Pyromancer, we've seen Red and 6 still having a massive impact on the format and being a ridiculously overpriced card. But nobody was talking about the one card that I was really intrigued by, that being Cordial Vampire. And then with M20 just a month or two later, we had the printing of Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, another card that I think most people didn't even look at as far as Modern goes. This is a 3-mana Planeswalker that puts a vampire from your hand onto the battlefield. It's something that allows you to make your vampires bigger, lightning helix your opponent's face to finish them off. This card is really good. Why is no one talking about this card? So I did try to build this deck to be mono-black because mono-colored decks are my thing. I love me some mono-colored decks. Unfortunately, there are 2 vampires which I thought were just too good to pass off, so we had to splash a little bit of red in the main board and a little bit in the sideboard. Okay, so let's start off with the boring stuff, then we can move on to the more interesting stuff later on. So quickly go over the boring shit, move on to the good stuff later on. First up, the lands. There's nothing really interesting about a mana base, but here is the land base right here. 4 Blackleaf Cliffs. We don't really care about what's coming out tapped later on in the game. In fact, there is literally 3 cards that cost more than 3 mana in the deck, so sure, we might top like a Blackleaf Cliffs and need a red mana for a card that's coming up later on, but usually we don't really care about what's coming out tapped, whereas it can add that red mana very easily early in the game. 3 Blood Crypts, 4 Bloodstained Myers. We don't really care too much about paying life as such for Blood Crypts if we have to. We'd rather not, but we will if we have to. We can always go and fetch for a Blood Crypt as well for the Bloodstained Myers, which can also go and fetch for a basic mountain and one of our 7 swamps. That's the mana base. Let's move on to something more interesting. Let's quickly get out of the way other non-vampire spells, then we can move on to actual vampires and move on with our lives. First of all in the 1-drops, we have 2 Thoughtseize, 2 Inquisitions, 2 Fatal Pushes. And let's move on to the vampires, the thing you guys are here to see while you're looking at this face right now. First of all, we're going to start with Vampire Lacerator. You should say 1-drop, that's 2 power. That's exactly what you want in any creature aggro deck. Ideally, a 2 power creature for 1 mana. We do have to pay a life each upkeep for the first few turns, but we're an aggro deck. We don't care about that. Our life total in most matchups is going to be irrelevant. Now we're going to move on to the next group, which is vampires that synergize together incredibly well in the early to mid game, and the third group is going to be vampires that grow our other group, which synergizes really well together. I hope that makes sense. So another 1-drop, this is 1 red mana rather than the 1 black mana for Vampire Lacerator. We're playing a Falkenrath Gorger, another 2-1. We don't pay life this time, however, it does give our vampires that aren't onto the battlefield madness. So whenever we discard a vampire, we can pay its mana cost and instead put it onto the battlefield. So Falkenrath Gorger not only is a good aggressive card early in the game, as you'll see with our next card, it's going to allow us to grow our team for the turn, whilst also adding to the battlefield. The next card we'll talk about is Stromkirk Condemned, a reasonably recent vampire. It was only printed in Eldritch Moon, and to be honest, I'd never even heard of this card until I started looking for this deck. Now, Stromkirk Condemned is double black mana. That can sometimes be an issue, but we are mainly mono-black, splashing red for a couple of creatures. But we can discard a card and put a +1/+1 on our team till end of turn. It's not a counter like Cordial Vampire we discussed earlier, but it does put a +1/+1 on our team until end of turn. So with the Falkenrath Gorger out, we can discard the Vampire of Madness onto the battlefield and grow our team for the turn. So we're not even down a vampire, and yet we're still able to grow our team. So let's say we don't have the Falkenrath Gorger out, but we do have the Stromkirk Condemned. We would love to grow our team, but we don't really want to discard all of our vampires, really. Well, we have 2 types of vampires which we don't really have a major issue discarding. First of all, we have probably the most played vampire in the history of the game, being Bloodghast. Most people forget Bloodghast is a vampire spirit. So we discard this, okay. We put a +1/+1 up to our team till end of turn. Play a land, get back the Bloodghast from our graveyard to the battlefield. Maybe it has haste, maybe it doesn't, but either way, we've got our vampire back. We didn't have the Falkenrath Gorger up, but now we have a 2-1 with haste, potentially, that we can start swinging our opponent's face. The other vampire we can throw onto the battlefield without Falkenrath Gorger is a 1-of Asylum Visitor. So this has Madness itself, a 1 and a black, both its casting cost and the Madness cost. It's a 3-1, which is pretty damn big, especially if we can grow with other vampires later in the game. But on top of that, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, we can pay a life, or we do pay a life, and we draw a card instead. Again, we don't care about paying a life to draw a card, we just want to keep adding to the battlefield, and because our vampire deck is reasonably low to the ground, certainly in the early game, we're going to be able to play most cards out of our hand and keep drawing cards every turn. And again, with Strongkirk Condemned out, we can discard that, grow our team, and get a 3-1 out of the deal. So now we've seen our 1-drops, we've seen our 2-drops that synergize really well together, we've built a nice, stable start to the game. Now it's time to grow those creatures and end the game as quickly as possible. So we're going to move on to the next group of vampires, the ones that grow our team and just end the game. But we're going to start off with the card we identified earlier being Cordial Vampire. Whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on all of your vampires. Well, fucking hell! I mean, if our opponent wants to block any of our vampires, that grows our team. If our opponent wants to kill Cordial Vampire, that grows the rest of our team. If our opponent wants to kill any of our vampires, it grows the rest of our team. It basically means that if you kill one vampire, it basically replaces itself multiple times over with +1/+1 counters across the board. That is fucking insane. It's a 2-mana 1/1, so by itself it's quite a bad card, but to be honest, this deck is all about building up a battlefield and ending the game before your opponent can get control of the board. So that is the end of the 2-drops, so we're going to move on to the 3-drops now, and this is where most of our lords are. We're going to start off with a Captivating Vampire, and this is a 3-mana vampire that gives all of our other vampires +1/+1. But we can also tap 5 vampires and take control of an opponent's creature, and that becomes a vampire as well. Now, if you think about it, if we're playing against maybe a Tron deck that managed to slap down a Wormcoil Engine, we'll just take control of the Wormcoil Engine permanently. Even if you get rid of the Captivating Vampire, we keep control of the Wormcoil Engine as well. Our next lord is going to be our second of only 2 red cards in this deck. We have a Strongkirk Condemned, a +1/+1 for all of our vampires, and it gives itself first strike and all other vampires first strike as well. Now that is hugely relevant. If you think about Strongkirk Condemned, where we're able to discard a card and then put a +1/+1 on our team till end of turn, if you think about then giving our creatures +1/+1 and first strike, and you have a Cordial Vampire out, where your opponent has to block, their creatures will die, and even if they don't die, first strike damage happens, the counter goes on our creatures, and then maybe our creatures, even if their creature doesn't die to first strike damage, maybe our creatures survive because they get that little bit bigger because of the Cordial Vampire putting a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures. Our final vampire is a 4-drop, and this is a Vampire Nocturnus. Now this is the one vampire I'm a little bit apprehensive with Blackcleave Cliffs about, because we draw Blackcleave Cliffs off the top on turn 4. We'd like to cast this card on turn 4, and unfortunately the Blackcleave Cliffs will come out tapped. But, forgetting that for a second, this card is freaking insane, and my god, it makes me question, why the hell has vampires never really been a thing in Modern? This card is insane! It's a 4-mana 3/3, that's not that exciting. However, we play with the top card of our library revealed. If the top card of our library is black, all of our vampires get +2/+1. That's pretty good, right? That's like a really, really good lord. And flying! What the fuck? Flying as well? So that's just game. Like, if we play this, and there's like a black card on top of our library and our opponent doesn't have a removal spell, G motherfucking G, because this game is over. You are not blocking all of these vampires with flying unless you're playing like spirits or something like that. And even then, I would probably hazard a guess this deck would probably overpower spirits on board with first strike, growing our team when a creature dies and stuff like that. So, you know what? My god, this card. Let's also remember as well, if you don't count lands, which by the way are not black cards, unless specified otherwise, all lands are colourless. We have 21 lands and 4 mono red vampires, which are the Falconwrath Gorges. That is 25 cards in our library, so statistically speaking, we are way more likely to hit a black card than not hit a black card. Now the final card we're going to talk about this deck is the new Sorin from M20, which is just built for vampires. First of all, it is a 3-drop. 3-drop vampires sometimes are good, sometimes are Jace, Cunning Castaway, and never see play because it's just that bad. But Sorin is not bad. Sorin is good. We can do a +1, and we can put a +1/+1 counter on a target vampire, and also that vampire gets lifelink and death touch until end of turn. So we grow a vampire permanently. Let's just say we play a Falconwrath Gorge early in the game. We don't have a 2-drop. Let's just say we've really got flooded or something like that. We can still play a Sorin, +1/+1 counter on Falconwrath Gorge, and then we get in for 3 points of damage turn rather than 2. We can also +1, sacrifice a vampire, and lightning helix something. But the big thing with this one is the -3. We get to put a vampire from our hand onto the battlefield. Now think about that for a second. Not only does it die because it's a 4 toughness planeswalker or a 4 loyalty counter planeswalker, we do a -3, we put a 3-drop or a 4-drop from a hand onto the battlefield, so we've still paid 3 mana, essentially for that 3 mana Vampire Lord, or got more value from a Vampire Nocturnus to put it onto the battlefield. But then we still get a Sorin which hangs around for next turn to put a +1/+1 counter on our stuff. We get to sacrifice a vampire for reach and stuff like that, so my god, this card is just built for vampires. Now that was the main board. We're going to move on to the sideboard, and we're going to start off with 2 more Thoughtseize. Sometimes we're against maybe a control deck or something where we really need to make sure there's something like an Ensnaring Bridge maybe not in their hand. Get rid of that thing, don't want to see it. 3 Collective Brutalities, again a way of us being able to discard cards after sideboarding. With the Falconrath Gorger out, this would require a lot of mana, but we could maybe, if we get to 3 mana, Collective Brutality, discard a 1-drop, cast a 1-drop, that wouldn't be too bad. Drain our opponent, maybe check the hand, stuff like that. But more often than not, our opponent has a small creature niggling around. Maybe we need that extra little bit of reach to drain them for 2 points of life. Maybe we need to check the hand for something. Maybe we're against control or something like that. 2 Terminates. If our opponent's playing loads of smaller creatures that we're really worried about, bring in some extra removal, get the little things out of the way, and start swinging with our vampires. 2 Damnations. Now this is a bit of a weird one because we are essentially a creature aggro deck that isn't really that resilient when a board wipes happened. But if we're against an uber aggressive deck with loads of creatures out, we can just hang back. That's fine. We can hang back. We can maybe play a Bloodghast or 2 out, and then wait for our opponent to overextend, and we Damnation away the board, and then we play out our vampires, and our vampires can get really big really quick. 4 Leyline of the Void, a reminder this deck was played when Hogaak, Bridge from Below were both legal in the format. In fact, it was literally 2 days before Hogaak or Bridge from Below was banned. But at the time, Leyline was kind of needed, and it's mainly there to deal with graveyard decks, like the Hogaak deck. But the good thing about this deck is that not only do we have the Leylines, we've got a very quick clock, very quick clock, meaning that whereas a lot of decks, they maybe play a Leyline, and then your opponent plays a few Faithless Lootings, gets a Nature's Claim, get rid of the Leyline in the Void, and then they kind of have nothing. Well, actually, our opponent doesn't have much time to get rid of that Leyline, because our creatures are going to be bigger than theirs, and they're going to be just as aggressive, and they're going to end the game really quickly if they can't get rid of it straight away. And finally, a 2-of Vampire Hexmage, which is only really here to deal with opposing Planeswalkers. Sometimes maybe our opponent plays a Teferi or something like that. We don't want to see that hang around. Let's just play our Vampire Hexmage, sacrifice it, get rid of those counters on that Planeswalkers. The Planeswalkers dies. I will trade one of my Vampires for one of your Planeswalkers. Sounds pretty damn good to me. And that was Rakdos Vampires. I hope you guys enjoy this deck tech. I'm going to go ahead and look at some games right now. But before we do, if you guys like me enough, go ahead and leave a like down below. Leave a comment and tell me what the hell do you think of this vampire deck. If you haven't done so yet, leave me a subscribe. Hopefully there'll be more videos like this soon. Probably won't be sitting down at a sofa like some kind of absolute player though. Instead I'm going to be maybe standing in front of a green screen, although this has been kind of fun. Maybe I'll do this again. I see why actually Dev from SBMTG does this. This is kind of good. Our opening hand does need one more black source of mana, but I think it's worth taking the risk since we have 2 1-drops plus a Fatal Push, and the hand really does go off if we can hit our second, and especially third, source of mana. A Blood Crypt and an Insolent Neonate for our opponent. Are we against the Vampire Mirror? Is our opponent playing their own version of Rakdos Vampires? Or more than likely, our opponent is playing the broken Hogaak deck. Now, if you will notice down in your bottom right hand corner of your screen, we're playing this on the 4th of July. I'm pretty sure as an English person, I meant to remember that date for some reason, but it just eludes me. 4 days after this date, Bridge from Below did indeed get banned from Modern, so the Hogaak deck, as you guys will note at the point of you seeing this video, is not quite as good as it once was. However, for now, we are playing against the full-strength Hogaak deck. We lead on Falconrath Gorger over the Vampire Lacerator. Now, the reason we go for the 2-1 over the 2-2 is because we top deck the Swamp and we could find the Stromkirk Condemned off the top, which means that we could play that on turn 2 and then going into turn 3 we can discard some of our Vampires and then get them on the field. I'm also perfectly fine with trading my Falconrath Gorger for my opponent's Insolent Neonate because if they want to trade, it means they're not going to put a creature into their graveyard. Speaking of which, our opponent does indeed sacrifice the Insolent Neonate. They put a Stinkweed Imp into their graveyard and they dredge instead of drawing from the Insolent Neonates. Now the dredge goes in our favour. Our opponent puts some key cards into their graveyard, an Altar of Dementia, a Stitcher's Supplier, 2 lands, and rather puzzlingly, a Mindrake. That's an adaptation I haven't seen before. We go to our opponent's turn and things might actually be looking up for us. Our opponent plays a Carrion Feeder and a Gravecrawler. We can Fatal Push that Carrion Feeder when the Gravecrawler is in their graveyard, meaning they can get a whole bunch of counters on it, but it will die. But our joy is short-lived as our opponent casts a fucking Hogaak from their hand, meaning that now we're going to be really far behind on board. Why the fuck does this thing have to have Trample? Do wizards never learn about putting Delve on cards? I was about ready to concede because I don't think we can beat that card, but then we top deck the Captivating Vampire, which keeps us somewhat interested. If we can get down 5 vampires and not die, we're going to be able to take control of that Hogaak permanently. So you see this really dark tunnel we're in, like really super dark tunnel where you can't even see the hand in front of you, but you can see that speck of light at the end of the tunnel. That's us right now. There is that speck of light which is just about helping us cling to life. I decided to go ahead and Fatal Push the Carrion Feeder now. I'm not too bothered about the Gravecrawler as such, and I just want to make sure there's no kind of combat tricks next turn or anything like that. Get the thing off the battlefield while we still can. We go to our opponent's turn, they get in for 8 points of damage with Hogaak. There's no way we can block, our only win condition is to literally take control of that thing. They cast an Altar of Dementia, and all of a sudden, life is looking really bad for us. Our opponent sacrifices the Gravecrawler, they find a Vengevine, but no Bridge from Below, meaning we survive for 1 more turn. There's a very high chance our Vampire Lacerator kills us here, as on our upkeep we take 2 damage because our opponent is not below the 10 points of life required. We top deck another Captivating Vampire. I decide that the only way we're realistically going to win is if this Cordial Vampire can somehow get a whole bunch of counters on all of our creatures. We cast this, we get in for some points of damage, and the hope is that we might be able to snatch the game from our opponent at this point. I don't think we can block. We've only got 1 more turn where we can take damage from Vampire Lacerator, and if we can get our opponent down to 11 here, maybe they fetch next turn, get themselves down to 10 points of life so Vampire Lacerator doesn't deal damage to us. What a lot of people also forget with Cordial Vampire is it's whenever a creature dies, so our opponent is potentially going to sacrifice a lot of creatures here, so it might grow our team, and if they're not careful, we might be able to sneak the game. Our opponent sacrifices Hogaak, we put a counter on all of our team. The Altar of Dementia triggers, and unfortunately they do find the Bridge from Below. Our opponent can just win the game essentially if they have 1 zombie card in their hand, because they can cast the zombie, get back the Gravecrawler, and then use the 2 black creatures to delve for Hogaak, and then keep sacrificing the Hogaak to Altar of Dementia to get zombies from the Bridge from Below. However, if our opponent doesn't have it, if we top deck a land, a Captivating Vampire or a Strong Kirk Captain is going to be lethal because we will have exactly 11 points of damage on board. Our opponent does find the Stitcher Supplier, and that's all but signifies game, but it's really impressive that our opponent had, whilst not a nut draw, a pretty damn good draw, and we were still potentially winning the game next turn. But this is both a good and a bad situation. The good thing is that our Cordial Vampire is putting a whole bunch of counters on our creatures because our opponent is sacrificing creatures to the Altar of Dementia, growing our entire team. The downside is that even though we probably won't die this turn, we will die on our own upkeep because our opponent will sacrifice all of these zombie tokens they're making to mill our entire deck, and we die on our own draw step. After our opponent hits the second Bridge from Below in their graveyard, I concede the game because I know we can't possibly win at this point. During sideboarding, our strategy is pretty clear. Get a Leyline of the Void in our opening hand, and then have a quick clock before our opponent can either cast a whole bunch of creatures on board and grow a pretty big Carrion Feeder, or find a Nature's Claim for the Leyline of the Void. We take out Vampire Nocturnus. Whilst I love this card, it is a 4-drop, and we want to be aggressive here. We also bring in Thoughtseize, which means we're going to take out a Sorin and a Strommed Kirk Condemned. The plan here is we have a whole bunch of small vampires, and we back them up with Lords or maybe a Cordial Vampire to grow our team and end the game before our opponent can find that removal for the Leyline. In game 2, that is way too many lands. We mulligan that into 2 Leylines, and actually not a bad hand. A Bloodghast, an Asylum Visitor, plus an actual Sorin to grow our team. Now we are on the new London Mulligan rule, so I do have to put a card back. I opt for Bloodghast. I don't know if this is the right decision or not. The other option was Sorin. I think the Asylum Visitor will draw us cards. Even if it's just going to get a piece of removal out of our opponent's hand, it's probably worth it. The Bloodghast can get it for a couple of points of damage per turn, but I think I would much rather have that Sorin on the field, growing our Asylum Visitor so we have a big chunky creature that's drawing us cards every turn and potentially gaining us life. And remember, we're likely to get empty-handed here because we're putting 2 cards out before we even play a single land. It also really helps our opponent mulligan to 5, so now they need to find 2 pieces of graveyard hate removal, plus they have to build up their graveyard. So this hand, whilst not being the most aggressive hand we could hope for, I will certainly take this situation more times than not. Our opponent plays an Overgrown Tomb, they shock themselves and they pass to us. Now that just reeks of a Nature's Claim in their hand. Shock yourself with an Overgrown Tomb and do nothing. We top deck a Stromkirk Condemned, which is a fantastic draw. We can now just discard cards on our draw step if we don't like them to draw a card with a Silent Visitor going forward. It also synergizes really well with the Silent Visitor because we can discard a card to grow our team and madness in the Silent Visitor anyway. And our opponent, who played their turn 1 so transparently they may as well be a window, plays a Nature's Claim on end step to take out one of our ley lines, meaning we've now got just 1 ley line left on the field, but I will still take that. Our opponent shocks themselves with a Blood Crypt, not too disheartened to see that. We want to get their life total low enough so we can end the game before they get set up, and they cast a Faithless Looting. They get rid of a Bloodghast and an Insolent Neonate. We top deck a Captivating Vampire, not bad if we can just keep top decking lands from this point on. We get it for 2 points of damage, we discard the Silent Visitor to get in for an extra point of damage whilst madnessing it in, and we pass to our opponent. And Spaghetti-O. Our opponent does find the second Nature's Claim, but on the plus side, with their draw step, they only have 3 cards in hand. Unfortunately, they follow up with a Stitcher's Supplier, which is probably a good follow-up. It puts cards into their graveyard. Let's hope this isn't too bad. Our opponent dumps just lands and another Nature's Claim into their graveyard, so overall, not the worst we could ever see. We top decked the land we so desperately needed, and we cast our Sorin, and we actually -3 to put the Captivating Vampire into play. Now, I think this is a really sweet synergy. So far, our deck in Game 2 here has been perfectly synergistic. We've been able to discard the Silent Visitor to the Stromkirk Condemned. We've been able to put the Captivating Vampire onto the battlefield for free, along with a Sorin Imperious Bloodlord. We grow our team, we get in for a whole bunch of damage. Now, the one downside of this turn is our opponent did get to block with a Stitcher's Supplier, and that's going to happen at some point anyway. Our opponent this time does find a Gravecrawler and a Bloodghast in their graveyard, so whilst not the worst thing we could have ever seen, certainly not the best thing either. However, the Gravecrawler and the Bloodghast cannot block, and our opponent does need a blocker for next turn. And judging by our opponent's concession, they don't actually have one. We make no sideboard changes after this game. We go on to game 3, and fuck me, look at that hand. 7 cards, 2 ley lines, a 1 and a 2-drop, and 3 lands, meaning that we can cast any card off the top of our library other than further Leyline of the Voids. Our opponent must be feeling pretty sick right now, and to be honest, I would feel sorry for them, other than the fact they're playing Hogaak. Our opponent does keep their 7-card hand, they play a Polluted Delta, and they pass to us. Now, if you guys will forgive me, I'm about to go out and buy a lottery ticket because look at that top deck. With the Stromkirk Captain giving our team First Strike, and the Cordial Vampire growing our team every time a creature dies, it basically makes our vampires unblockable, because it would be worse for our opponent to actually block, because it would grow our team and they would take more damage next turn. Also remember, the Hogaak deck needs to play cards that put cards into their graveyard and play actual Hogaak, actual Altar of Dementia. They have to play removal that gets rid of Leylines of the Void. They're not playing Fatal Pushes, they're not playing Anger of the Gods, or at least not many of them, so this hand looks virtually unbeatable at this point. Now, there is a slight worry here. Our opponent does play a Nature's Claim on end step to get rid of one of our Leyline of the Voids, and we're hoping to avoid the second Nature's Claim going later into the game. Our opponent shocks themselves with a Blood Crypt. Again, not too scared of seeing that. We want to kill our opponent as quickly as possible. They cast a Faithless Looting, and they discard a Hogaak and a Bloodghast. Not too disappointed to see that. Looks like our opponent is miles off getting a Hogaak down. They play Stitcher's Supplier. Holy crap, am I happy to see that. Our opponent's going to mill over a Bridge from Below, another Hogaak, a Swamp, meaning that all of those cards are gone permanently, even if they do find an answer for our second Leyline. We top deck the Inquisition of Kozilek, and my plan here is to cast this turn. It doesn't mean we're going to take a turn off from putting vampires onto the battlefield, but if we can snag maybe a Faithless Looting out of their hand, a Stitcher's Supplier number 2, something that's going to help them loot through their library, I think it's worth taking the turn off to just check that hand. It also means we can put this Blood Crypt out tapped. We get in with the Vampire Lacerator, and our opponent blocks with their Stitcher's Supplier. Now, the Stitcher's Supplier does not trigger because it doesn't die, it gets exiled, so there aren't more cards getting milled over. We check the hand with an Inquisition of Kozilek, and we see a Bridge from Below and a Lightning Axe plus a Bloodstained Mire. I'm taking the Bridge from Below here, even though that is removal in their hand. I think the only way we can realistically lose this game now is if our opponent can get rid of the Leyline of the Void, get that Bridge from Below in their graveyard, and then maybe they can go off. I'm not too bothered about a little bit of removal, especially if that removal is going to trigger our Cordial Vampire. Now, unfortunately, not much else really happens in this one. Our opponent never really builds up a board. They end up lightning axing our Cordial Vampire, growing our Vampire Lacerator. We top deck a Fatal Push, we cast a Stormkirk Captain, and our opponent never really does much else, and that is the game. We take down Hogaak, and I think the key here is we had not just Leyline, the graveyard hate, but we also had bigger creatures on field, and we were able to put a quick clock together so our opponent could never draw out of the issue they had. 1-0 for Vampires. In match 2, we're going to do a freaking fast play because apparently Green-Black Rock takes a fucking age to actually work. We keep an opening hand that has a bit of a rough mana base. We do have 2 Field of Ruins rather than the black mana source, but if we can find that black mana source, life is good. Our opponent has 2 Tarmogoyfs and Assassin's Trophy in hand. We top deck the Fatal Push after taking the original Tarmogoyf, so this is going quite well in the early game for us. We get rid of both Goyfs, and we have these Blood Gas. Because we're so damn lucky, we find the Blood Crypt, or the Bloodstain Mire off the top. We cast our Stormkirk Condemned, and we pass to our opponent. I think I should have discarded a Bloodghast on my opponent's end step because we can only discard 1 card per turn, and if my opponent finds removal and we know they have the Assassin's Trophy in hand, then we can only discard 1 Bloodghast, and we'd rather have the Bloodghast in our graveyard because we just play a land and we get back the Bloodghast for free rather than paying mana for it. We get in for some damage. Our opponent Assassin's Trophy, we discard 1 of our Bloodghast that we're allowed to do this turn. We can't madness it in, but it doesn't really matter. We're quite happy with that one being in the graveyard. Assassin's Trophy resolves, and because I believe in the maximum of synergies, we get back our Bloodghast for free. I decided to go ahead and take out one of my opponent's lands with a Field of Ruin. It is a Treetop Village, that is essentially a creature. My opponent finds another Assassin's Trophy, and they fetch. We find another Fatal Push, and now with 2 Bloodghasts in our hand, that is a rather splendid quick clock. And we have the Fatal Push to get any shitty little creature out of the way. Speaking of which, a Hex Drinker, a rather swish new creature for this deck from Modern Horizons. We wait for them to pump it all the way up to the point it would have protection from instants, and then we Fatal Push it to waste all of their mana. We top deck the Black Necklace, but we shall not play it until our Bloodghast shall be in our graveyard. We want to have the maximum amount of recursion we can. We play a Vampire Lacerator, and our opponent is looking at a pretty quick turn or 2, and even 1 blocker now wouldn't really get them there. Our opponent Field of Ruins, our Field of Ruin, not a bad idea, and we are not too sad to see Liliana of the Veil. If they make us discard this land, who cares? If they make us sacrifice a creature, who cares? We get in for 6 points of damage, we put our opponent down to 1. We have the Falconruff Gorger. I think I should have held this back, actually, just in case our opponent has a board wipe, but I think it's still perfectly fine. Our opponent concedes, and we shall go to the sideboarding. Now, it's really important we took game 1 off of Green-Black Rock. Typically speaking, that deck has a lot of interaction, and we need to keep many vampires on the battlefield. Having 1 vampire versus their massive Tarmogoyf, well, their Tarmogoyf is just going to be bigger. We need to have multiple vampires on the battlefield, so taking that game 1 was really damn important, because now we have 2 cracks at winning just 1 more game. After sideboarding is done, we just bring in 2 Terminates for 1 Captivating Vampire and 1 Falconruff Gorger. Our opponent rather annoyingly begins with an Inquisition of Kozilek to take our Inquisition of Kozilek, and we are drawing a lot of lands here, which is not really what we want in this matchup. We need to hit the ground running. Our opponent casts a Collective Brutality, and rather puzzlingly, they use an Inquisition of Kozilek to drain us for 2 points of damage instead. I think it would have been better for them if they used Inquisition of Kozilek to take one of our vampires this turn, and then Collective Brutality the other vampire next. And I think it was definitely a misplay from our opponent. They follow with a Tarmogoyf, we find another bloody land, but we have a Vampire Lacerator. We're starting to fill out the board, we just need to avoid any kind of removal. Our opponent plays a Hex Drinker, and unfortunately they have the mana to tick that thing up and give it protection from instants. That will be a rather slight problem for us. We find our second Cordial Vampire, and this is the situation this deck loves. Cordial Vampire is massively underrated. Watch your opponent play Liliana Last Hope here, which is usually really bad for creature aggro decks. They target a Cordial Vampire, but the Cordial Vampire dies, and it triggers 2 Cordial Vampires to put 2 counters on both of our vampires. All of a sudden, we are still in this game, despite the fact our opponent has technically bigger creatures. Our opponent chump blocks with Tarmogoyf. I don't get the thinking there. My opponent could have just taken the damage on Liliana, but now they just grow our vampires. It leads me to believe that now our opponent with 0 cards in hand needs to find some removal pretty damn quick. A Lily Last Hope won't do it for them. Now our opponent does downtick on Liliana, and I'm still not too sure this was all entirely worth it. They managed to grow their Hex Drinker a little bit more, but it doesn't have protection from everything just yet. It would need one more level up. Our opponent does have the Tarmogoyf in hand, and we're going to take this opportunity to say to our opponent, look, do you want to lose your Hex Drinker, or do you want to lose your Liliana? The Stromkirk Condemned was a fantastic top deck. We are quite happy trading a discarded land and one of our creatures for their Hex Drinker, because it's going to get a lot bigger next turn. It almost guarantees that Liliana will die here. Our opponent's also on 14 points of life. Remember, our vampires are pretty damn big. We find another Cordial Vampire up the top, and this card has been really impressive this game. Our opponent does have an Assassin's Trophy in response, which is still going to put a counter on both of our vampires, and we still have a Cordial Vampire hanging around. This deck is actually being resilient to one of the most interactive decks in the format. That's really surprising to me. Our opponent cracks a Nihil Spellbomb to trade in for a different card. They played the Tarmogoyf that they got from their graveyard earlier on, and all of a sudden, with the Treetop Village, our opponent's starting to have a pretty decent ground game here. We really need to make sure that we can end this game before they get much more interaction, because we're really starting to fall behind on board. We top deck our Sorin Vampire, but unfortunately this is the most awkward position to possibly find him in. Our only real play is to tick up and to put a counter on one of our vampires. Unfortunately, sacrificing a vampire to hit something for 3 damage at this point is just not worth it, and we have no vampire in our hand to put onto the battlefield. Luckily, we can put that counter, we get in for 7 points of damage, and I forgot our opponent has protection from everything with the Hex Drinker, meaning it does not take any damage, and the Death Touch is irrelevant. Our opponent Fatal pushes the Cordial Vampire, which again is going to grow our team. Now, it's obviously not great we're losing a vampire and all we get is counters on our permanents, but it does mean that if our opponent does attack with his Hex Drinker, we can potentially take the game afterwards. So actually, Cordial Vampires are keeping us in the game. Our opponent swings in 1 creature at Sorin, 1 creature at us, puts us down to 6 points of life, and all of a sudden, with the Scavenging Ooze, we are almost certainly dead next turn. Our opponent is essentially on 16 life thanks to the Scavenging Ooze. They're going to have 2 green mana open to pump their life total up by 2. Even more annoyingly, we have 12 points of damage on the field, plus we can discard the Blackcleave Cliffs to get in for the 14 points of damage. Literally, our only top deck is a Vampire Nocturnus. We draw the Vampire Nocturnus, however, it's irrelevant unless there is a black card on top of our library. Remember, Vampire Nocturnus does specify if the top card is black, then our creatures get flying and +2/+1. The top card is a Bloodghast, meaning that now with the discarded Blackcleave Cliffs to our Stromkirk Condemned, our opponent must be dead unless they have a removal spell in their hand as their last card. They don't, we win the game, and I can't believe we 2-0'd Green-Black Rock with a Vampires deck. But this was a great showing for not only Cordial Vampire, which really kept us in the game, but also that Vampire Nocturnus is just a massive knockout blow to most decks if they don't have a removal spell. You saw there, that was 16 points of damage in 1 turn. This deck is the Mike Tyson of creature aggro decks. It just knocks motherfuckers out of nowhere. So this is going to be a very quick matchup that I'm not going to replay the entire thing because I basically lost it before the match started because I made a bit of a deck building error. Do you remember sideboarding? Most people in sideboards do put some kind of artifact hate. I didn't. So when we're playing against an Urza artifact deck, yeah. With that being said, we do take down game 1. The Vampire Nocturnus would have been game the turn afterwards when our opponent conceded anyway, and it looks like we just got a good aggro draw here. That was a turn 3 concession from our opponents. You can see the sideboarding here, no actual pieces of artifact destruction, despite the fact we're splashing red. So that could have been a Colligan's Command and a Braid. It could have been a Smash to Smithereens. Instead, yeah, nothing. Our only realistic win condition here is to be as aggressive as possible, and this opening hand on 7 is about as good as we're going to get. We start with a Blood Crit, we go Falconwrath Gorgia. However, our opponent has a Galvanic Blast, and they play a Goblin Engineer to put a Sword of the Meek into the graveyard. We cast an Inquisition of Kozilek, and our opponent has both Ghirapur Aether Grid and the Goblin Engineer. We have to take the Goblin Engineer, we can't allow them to get the other part of the combo into their graveyard. We have to give them the Ghirapur Aether Grid, which is really, really bad for us. Having said that, our opponent has no artifacts on the field at the minute, so they're going to be struggling to use that Ghirapur Aether Grid. We top deck a Stromkirk Condemned, which is actually a pretty decent top deck. With that down, when our opponent tries to shoot something down with Ghirapur Aether Grid, we're going to be able to discard a card in response. Our opponent eventually gets down Urza and the Giraport Aether Grid, however they're now empty-handed and we're going to start being able to take control of every single one of their creatures. All we need them to do is not find Ensnaring Bridge. We find a strong Kurt Condemned off the top, which means that now we can empty our entire hand and take control of Urza and get in for some damage this turn. We have lethal next turn on the assumption our opponent doesn't find that Ensnaring Bridge. Even if they block our biggest creatures, we're able to discard the card we draw for our turn and grow our team by 1, and that will most definitely be lethal. Well, last match we topped it like an absolute beast with Vampire Nocturnus, and this time our opponent finds the Goblin Engineer off the top. They get the Ensnaring Bridge, they put it out, and that is game. We have no removal spell for that, and even though we had lethal, our opponent found the perfect card off the top. Even though we don't have Artifact Destruction in our deck, I decided to bring in Leylines not just for the combo of Sword of the Meek, but also it means they have to naturally draw the Ensnaring Bridge. Unfortunately, we draw a second Leyline off the top. However, we do have a Bloodghast and a Vampire Nocturnus in our hand, so hopefully we can get a pretty good start to this game and put them right on the back foot. And with Strong Kurt Captain as our top deck, that's going to smooth out our mana curve really nicely, and unfortunately our opponent finds a Thopter Foundry, which is going to make loads of blockers for them this game. However, luckily for us, we do have the Leyline down, so anything like a Sword of the Meek will not make infinite Thopters, so we're not completely dead just yet. We find another Vampire Nocturnus, our opponent does find the Sword of the Meek combo, they do find an Urza, and yet again this has been quite an impressive show from this Vampires deck. Our opponent's last card in hand is the War of Invention, which gets them the Ensnaring Bridge and means by the thinnest of margins, our opponent in 2 games manages to just survive. Now, it is down to me, it is poor deck building to not have Artifact Destruction in the sideboard, that is on me. However, the main Vampire game plan here has really shown itself even when really up against it. In match 4, we are against Esper Shadow, and we're going to be very briefly going over this game. The game starts out with our opponent disrupting our hand a shit ton with Inquisition and Thoughtseize, and this is kind of the matchup we don't really want to see. Death Shadow has a crap ton of interaction. However, yet again, it's a matchup where we have 2 Cordial Vampires in our hand and a Vampire Nocturnus later in the game. It feels like if our opponent can't disrupt our board too much early, even if they have removal spells later in the game, it's just going to grow our team ridiculously big. Our opponent casts a few Thought Scours, they draw a few cards out of their library, and they do manage to unearth a Death Shadow. However, our opponent is on 6 life. If we can somehow get down this Vampire Nocturnus, you know what? I think we'll be okay. We also have the Captivating Vampire, which is, if we can get down enough vampires, going to take control of that Death Shadow. Now, granted, the Death Shadow will die straight away because our life total will be above 13, but the main thing is it will get stuff out of the way. Our opponent finds yet another Thoughtseize, and this time, they do take the Cordial Vampire. Our opponent is on 4 life, so we're now in a position where actually we're remotely close to being able to just win the game on board. We top deck 2 lands in a row, which allows us to get down our Captivating Vampire and then the Vampire Nocturnus. There is a Vampire Lacerator on top of our library, and our opponent could have Path to Exile or something like that, but I'm just going to go for it. We swing in and we kill our opponent. In sideboarding, we bring in some Leylines and some Terminates. I bring in some Thoughtseize as well. I take out the Strong Kurt Captain. I think having First Strike on our Vampires isn't really going to be that relevant, and growing them by 1 probably isn't going to be relevant either. I take out 1 Sorin as well, and the Vampire Lacerators. I don't really want to be getting for chip points of damage early because it's going to help grow their Death Shadows later on in the game, and instead I'd rather have more interaction with Thoughtseize and Terminates to destroy anything they do put down. We begin game 2 with a rather swish Leyline of the Void in our opening hand, which means it can go onto the battlefield, and that's going to turn off Jace's Prodigy, which they cast on turn 2. Also means Gurmag Angler is not going to be so easy for them to cast. We also saw an Unearth in game 1, so again, that cuts off a huge part of their deck. We terminate the Jace's Prodigy, and actually I'm quite happy just having 2 Bloodghasts here. That's a recursion, as well as a reasonably quick clock, as we saw in match 1. Now, as you guys will see, there is a crap ton of interaction both sides, especially from our opponent's side of the board. They do have the Deputy of Detention to take out the Leyline of the Void, which turns on their deck completely. We need to find removal, and we're just not finding it in this early part of the game. However, we do have Vampire Nocturnus, which will hopefully get us in for a huge amount of damage. We go ahead and play a Bloodghast, we play our Blood Crypt and get back the Bloodghast from our graveyard anyway, and we're going to be able to hopefully Vampire Nocturnus next turn and put our opponent on a 2-turn clock. We're hoping to avoid any real interaction here. We find a second Vampire Nocturnus off the top, and there is a Stromkirk Condemned on top of our library. Our opponent does have the Path to Exile, which is reasonably annoying, which means our opponent takes much less damage. They also have the Dismember for one of the Bloodghast, which is perfectly fine for them. They're reasonably happy getting the life total quite low. We do manage to get a few vampires out, but our opponent has just all of the interaction in the world. They have a Snapcaster Mage for that Path to Exile, get rid of another vampire, and eventually they're able to get down both a Gurmag Angler and a Death Shadow, and we just can't do anything about that. We'll move on to game 3. In the second part of sideboarding here, I decide to take a bit of a risk. I bring back in the Stromkirk Condemns and take out some Thoughtseize, as well as one Collective Brutality. We also bring back in 2 Vampire Lacerators. The thinking here is that we're not going to beat them in an interactive war. We need to make sure we have as many good top decks as we possibly can. Top decking a Collective Brutality and a Thoughtseize is not really good going later into the game. We want to make sure we can top deck that Vampire and just get over the line. Now, our opening hand is very good. We have the Leyline and a reasonably quick clock, and because we can empty our hand remotely quickly with this current hand, an Asylum Visitor is going to hopefully draw us quite a few more cards going into the mid to late game. Not for the first time today, we top deck a Leyline of the Void off the top of our library. That's becoming a trifle annoying. Our opponent opts and rather quizzically has a Nihil Spellbomb. I didn't think that was really worth playing against us. It only really deals with one card. I guess our opponent does get to draw a card off the Nihil Spellbomb most of the time, so it's not completely a dead card in the matchup, but I think I'd rather that be something a bit more interactive from their point of view. We start to fill out the board, and rather puzzlingly, our opponent decides to Path to Exile the Bloodghast, despite the fact you have a Nihil Spellbomb there anyway. I'm not too sure about that one. We keep drawing lands off the top, which isn't necessarily bad, because now we can cast our second Leyline of the Void and get our Asylum Visitor down, which will hopefully draw us a few cards going mid to late game. And also remember, if our opponent does have a removal spell for it, well, our Cordial Vampire will trigger and it will grow our other vampires. If they don't have removal for it, well, we're just going to keep adding to the board. I'm actually starting to think I should have put more Asylum Visitors in this deck now that I think about it, because our opponents have to remove it, and we have so many other things that do stuff if they do remove it. Our opponent casts a Dismember on the Asylum Visitor, it grows our team. With Vampire Nocturnus being such a good card in this deck all day, I decide to attack my opponent and basically say to him, look, you are very likely dead in the next couple of turns if you don't get some kind of blocker out. We get in for another 5 points of damage, and now our opponent needs 2 blockers or 2 removal spells to not die next turn. We also have a Fatal Push. Our opponent plays a land, and that all but signifies the end of the game. Our opponent does concede, and we take down Esper Death Shadow. Quite impressive that this deck, again, has been quite resilient to removal. I want you to lift me up so high, a place that no one's ever. Well, decks don't become more interactive than a Grixis Pyromancer deck. They're looking to play a small Pyromancer early and then play removal, 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 disruption, disruption, and make a whole bunch of tokens. So this is going to be the ultimate test to how this deck does deal with a really interactive deck of our opponents. Our opponent begins by Fatal Pushing our Falconwrath Gorger, not the end of the world. We follow up with 2 Vampire Lacerators. Now, 2/2s, pretty good against a Grixis Pyromancer deck. They have loads of tokens, granted, that is true, but we're still going to be able to get in for a lot of damage early, and with the 2 Stromkirk Captives in our hand and the Cordial Vampire, this could really be the matchup where Cordial Vampire becomes an absolute beast. We cast the Cordial Vampire, we get in for 4 points of damage at our opponent, and remember now, if they block with a token, the token dies. It means that the Cordial Vampire will put a count on all of our creatures, so basically, until they get rid of the Cordial Vampire, our vampires are virtually unblockable. Our opponent casts a Faithless Looting, and then follows up with an Inquisition of Kozilek. They do trigger on the Young Pyromancer, which makes 2 elemental tokens. They take the Thoughtseize, they shock themselves with a Blood Crypt, and they cast another Faithless Looting. Our opponent is going to be down to 2 cards in hand, and sure, they have a whole bunch of elemental tokens, but again, we don't really care. And if we top deck a land, we can put down Stromkirk Captain, and our creatures have First Strike. We do top deck the land, we put down Stromkirk Captain, and now our opponent needs multiple amounts of removal. Our vampires have +1/+1 and First Strike. Our opponent is pretty much obliged to block, which will just grow our team. That's going to put 2 counters on every vampire for next turn. Our opponent concedes, and this was by far the best showing of this deck so far in my opinion. The Cordial Vampire did an insane amount of work. Granted, we were lucky our opponent didn't have a crap ton of removal like they usually would, but you know what? I'll take it. In sideboarding, I take out a couple of Falconwrath Gorges for a couple of Thoughtseize. I could have maybe brought in some Brutalities as well, but I didn't want to disrupt the mana curve too much, so I wanted to take out some 1-drops for some 1-drops. We keep a very risky opening hand that has just 1 mana in it, but we have a Thoughtseize and a Fatal Push. We see our opponent is playing a Grixis version of the deck that has Ancestral Visions and Finale of Promises, so our opponent's going to get maximum amount of tokens from their young Pyromancers. Our opponent does play a young Peasy. We Fatal Push it to get it the fuck out of there, and unfortunately, we are not drawing land, so life is looking pretty bad. Our opponent suspends an Ancestral Vision, we finally top deck a land, and we're able to play a Stromkirk Condemned. Our victory is rather short-lived as our opponent abrades it, and it looks like we're in a race. We need to get down some kind of a board before that Ancestral Vision comes off suspend, because, well, life's going to be bad. Our opponent suspends a second Ancestral Vision, they play a Dreadhorde Arcanist, and it looks like they might just have too much value. We find a land, and I decide to cast Sorin, and yet again, we're in one of these situations where it's quite an awkward time to play it. We could go ahead and play a 3-drop Vampire from our hand with Sorin. The issue there is that our opponent could just attack with Dreadhorde Arcanist, maybe they have a removal spell for the Vampire, and then Sorin just dies. Instead, I decide to just tick up on Sorin, we'll try and get more stuff out next turn. I'm just going to skip towards the end of this game because we just get ground out in our opponent's value engine with loads of interaction. It's pretty much a disaster area for us. We never really have a chance of making anything out of this game. I concede to save time and save my life. I'd much rather go to sideboarding where now I can bring in the Ley Lines of the Void and take out some of our higher mana curve. I don't want to be playing a 3-drop just to trade for my opponent's Lightning Bolt or their Fatal Push. In Game 3, our opening hand has far too many lands in it, and we mulligan into a different hand that doesn't have a ley line, unfortunately, but we've got a reasonably quick clock. We just need to hope our opponent isn't too interactive here. We reluctantly put back the Vampire Nocturnus. We need to draw multiple lands for that to be relevant. We Inquisition our opponent. Now, our opponent does have a couple of creatures and a Thought Scour, but I decide to take the Lightning Bolt. We have to be able to keep creatures on the battlefield to win this, so even though it sucks giving them a Dreadhorde Arcanist, a young Pyromancer, if they have a Lightning Bolt, we can't really trade their 1-drop for our 3-drop going into the mid to late game. We draw a Vampire Lacerator, but I opt to use all of the mana this turn. I'm going to have to eke out every single point of mana if we have any chance in this matchup. I put the Stromkirk Condemned down. The hope is next turn we draw a land, discard the Bloodghast, and then we're able to get the Bloodghast back and play the Stromkirk Captain. Our opponent does play their young Pyromancer, and we don't draw land, but we do draw another 1-drop, so not actually that bad. Get down a couple of Vampire Lacerators. Again, if we draw land off the top, we can empty our hand. Our opponent finds a Finale of Promise, which is an absolute disaster for us. They get to Lightning Bolt away one of our creatures, and Inquisitions take another card out of our hand, whilst growing tokens on the field. This is about as interactive as it gets. If this deck can win through this, you know what? Vampires is a real thing. Our opponent surgically extracts our Stromkirk Captains. Not overly sad to see that. It's another card out of our opponent's hand, but at the same time, we do need to somehow win this game, and I think it's down to Vampire Nocturnus now. We draw a Cordial Vampire off the top. Oh my god, this card. It's been so impressive. Sure, our opponent could have a removal spell for it, but the fact that it will still grow our team if our opponent attacks with any tokens, they just can't attack until this thing is off the field. Our opponent plays a Dreadhorde Arcanist, which, sure, if they can get a Lightning Bolt and attack with Dreadhorde Arcanist, they can kill the Cordial Vampire, but that will grow our other vampires on the field. The Faithless Looting went reasonably bad for them. There isn't much interaction in that graveyard. We top deck a Vampire Nocturnus, so now we just need to find lands. If we find lands, there's a very high chance we win. I cast the Bloodghast, and since we need lands, I'll attack with the Bloodghast. That sounds fine by me. I will quite happily trade a couple of tokens for my Bloodghast and put counters on all of my team. Our opponent is starting to fill out this battlefield quite nicely now, so I'm a little bit worried that if the Vampire Nocturnus gets taken out of our deck with a Surgical plus a Thoughtseize here, we probably can't win. Our opponent shocks themselves, and for some reason they cast a Faithless Looting with no cards in hand just to get a token. Not too sure about that one. However, it becomes abundantly clear why they did that, because they attack with the Dreadhorde Arcanist, they unearth a Seasoned Pyromancer, and we just double block the Dreadhorde Arcanist, which means that it puts a counter on all of our team. Yes, they get the Seasoned Pyromancer, yes, they get to draw some cards, but I'm not too sure about actually growing our team there. I guess it's worth it in the situation they're in, but if we just hit running lands now, this game is probably over. Like an absolute genius, I top deck a land and then play it before I attack with Bloodghast. A smart person, an intelligent person, a good Vampires player would have attacked with the Bloodghast first and then played the land afterwards. Unfortunately, I am not one of those things. Our opponent does block with the Seasoned Pyromancer, which puts 2 counters on all of our Vampires. I'm not too sure about that block. I guess our opponent does need to worry about actual Lightning Bolt. But yet again, Cordial Vampire, this freaking card, man. Our opponent does nothing of note, and we top deck a Bloodstained Mire. All we need now is a black card on top of our library. Our opponent is tapped out. We cast the Vampire Nocturnus, and, well, for fuck's sake, we're going to have to wait another turn. We get in with the Bloodghast yet again. There is a land on top of our library, so we know we're getting it back next turn. 2 triggers again on the Cordial Vampire. Again, this freaking card. How many counters is that now? I assume, fearing the worst, our opponent gets in with all of their tokens with the hope of killing us. I decide to not block with the Vampire Nocturnus, just in case there's some card I'm not thinking of. It's very unlikely we die from 11 points of life here with 2 cards in our opponent's hand, whereas I think if they remove the Vampire Nocturnus, they can win that way. We draw our Blood Crypt and we're hoping for a black card on top. It's a Leyline of the Void. Our opponent needs a removal spell right now. It has to be able to kill the Vampire Nocturnus, otherwise the game is over. We attack with everything, and our opponent loses a rather minuscule 45 life. Okay, at this point, seriously, Vampire Nocturnus and Cordial Vampire have been by far the biggest MVPs of this league. These 2 cards together really make this deck. Cordial Vampire has been one hell of an addition to Vampires. And where the hell has Vampire Nocturnus been? Why have I never heard of this card? It is so damn good. It is like a massive train wreck to your opponent's face. If I was to rebuild this deck, I think I would put some more Asylum Visitors in. I think I would always be reasonably happy having that card. We can grow it quite easily. It's a 3/1 naturally and it draws you more cards. I would also probably have some kind of artifact destruction in the sideboard, but we'll drop that. What really impressed me about this deck wasn't just the fact that it went 4-on-1, but also the matchups we had. There was a lot of interaction. Grixis Control, Esper Shadow, even Green Black Rock are very interactive decks. And to be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that I'm a moron who doesn't know to put artifact hate into my sideboard, as well as the Urza-Sword deck getting a reasonable amount fortunate in games 2 and 3, I don't think it's unrealistic that we could have ended up with a 5-0 here, and against some very hard decks to play against for this kind of strategy. I can't wait to play this deck again. I hope you guys enjoyed the Vampires video here. I thought it was really, really good. I will see you next time for something different. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye. Boom, what up guys, it's me back again. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Something Different. Remember to go over this way and look at some other videos over there. There's a subscribe button over there. I barely can say subscribe. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you next time. Much love, y'all.